"My ex called me fat," she whispered to the Mafia boss, unaware he'd burn the world for her. The rain in Chicago was unforgiving, slashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of L'Etoile, an upscale French restaurant where power and old money dined. Vincenzo Moretti, the undisputed head of the Moretti crime family, sat in his usual corner booth, a fortress of tufted leather and shadow. He was a man chiseled from marble and quiet menace, his tailored charcoal suit doing little to soften the sharp angles of his jaw or the dangerous stillness in his dark eyes. Across the room, oblivious to the predator in the corner, a scene was unfolding. Sophie Laurent wiped down a nearby table, her movements precise, despite the exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. She was ordinary in a way that made her invisible in places like this. Soft curves hidden beneath a slightly oversized black uniform, her dark hair pulled into a sensible, no-nonsense bun. She wasn't a supermodel or a socialite. She was a woman working double shifts to keep her grandfather's struggling bakery alive. Tonight, she just wanted to finish her shift and go home. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The bell above the heavy mahogany door chimed, admitting a couple who brought the damp chill of the street in with them. Sophie didn't need to look up to recognize the sharp, reedy laugh. It was Mark, her ex-fiancé, the man who had drained her savings for his startup and vanished, leaving her with nothing but debts and a shattered sense of self-worth. Beside him clung a woman who looked like she subsisted entirely on champagne and celery sticks, her designer dress clinging to a frame as sharp as her gaze. Sophie stiffened, her hand freezing on the polishing cloth. She tried to melt into the background, turning her face away, hoping the dim lighting would mask her identity. But Mark was notoriously loud. He caught sight of her, his eyes narrowing in a cruel, mocking gleam. He strutted over, the clinking of his expensive shoes sounding like a death knell in the quiet room. "Well, well," Mark sneered, his voice carrying over the ambient jazz. "Sophie, still scrubbing tables, I see. I thought you said you were going to be a pastry chef." Sophie kept her eyes on the table, her cheeks burning. "Excuse me, sir. I have other tables to attend to." The woman on Mark's arm giggled, a high, piercing sound. "Is this the one you told me about, babe? The one who ate all her feelings?" Mark smirked, looking Sophie up and down with undisguised disgust. He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to ensure the surrounding tables could still hear his venom. "I guess working in a restaurant didn't help. You really let yourself go, Soph. You got fat. No wonder I had to leave. I couldn't look at you anymore without feeling sick." The words struck like physical blows. Sophie felt the familiar sting of tears pricking her eyes, the old insecurities rushing back to suffocate her. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, desperately trying to maintain her composure. The restaurant had grown deathly quiet, the wealthy patrons watching the spectacle with mild, detached amusement. Except for one. In his shadowed booth, Vincenzo Moretti stopped swirling the amber liquid in his glass. His gaze, usually cold and detached, zeroed in on the cruel exchange. He didn't know the waitress. He didn't know her story. But Vincenzo despised bullies. He despised men who used cruelty as a weapon against those who couldn't fight back. And there was something about the quiet dignity in the way the woman held herself, refusing to break, that caught his attention. It wasn't pity he felt. It was a cold, simmering anger. Sophie, unable to bear the humiliation a second longer, turned to flee to the kitchen, but her foot caught on the edge of the plush carpet. She stumbled, the heavy silver tray she was holding clattering loudly to the floor. In a desperate attempt to catch it, she crashed against the edge of a nearby booth. "Vincenzo's booth," she gasped, instinctively putting out a hand to steady herself. Her palm landed squarely on the lapel of Vincenzo's expensive suit, leaving a faint, damp smudge. The entire restaurant held its breath. The Moretti boss was not known for his forgiveness. Sophie looked up, her tear-filled eyes meeting the cold, hard stare of the most dangerous man in Chicago. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Mark snickered from across the room, anticipating her destruction. I am so sorry," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling, waiting for the explosion. Vincenzo didn't yell. He didn't move. He simply stared at her, his dark eyes cataloguing the fresh tears, the flush of humiliation on her cheeks, and the way her lower lip trembled despite her obvious effort to keep it still. Then, slowly, he reached up and covered her hand with his own. His touch was warm, solid, and surprisingly gentle. "Don't apologize to me," Vincenzo rumbled, his voice a low baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. He shifted his gaze over her shoulder, the warmth instantly vanishing, replaced by a terrifying, Arctic chill directed squarely at Mark. "Apologize to him." He shifted his gaze over her shoulder, the warmth instantly vanishing, replaced by a terrifying Arctic chill directed squarely at Mark. "Apologize to him." The words hung in the air, confusing and terrifying. Sophie stared at Vincenzo, paralyzed. She couldn't apologize to Mark. It would break what little remained of her spirit. But defying the man holding her hand felt like signing her own death warrant. Sophie stammered, pulling her hand free. "I can't." Vincenzo didn't push. Instead, he slowly rose to his full height. He was a mountain of a man, imposing and lethal. The restaurant, already quiet, seemed to shrink away from him. He adjusted his cuffs, his eyes never leaving Mark, who was suddenly looking less smug and more like a cornered rat. "You misunderstand me," Vincenzo said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who commanded life and death. He stepped out of the booth, placing himself subtly between Sophie and the rest of the room. "I didn't say apologize to her. I said apologize to him." Mark puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his pride in front of his new girlfriend. "Excuse me? Who do you think you are? She bumped into you. She's a clumsy cow who can't even hold a tray right." Vincenzo moved. It wasn't a rush. It was a predatory stalk. Within seconds, he was standing inches from Mark. The height difference was comical, the power dynamic, terrifying. Vincenzo didn't raise his hand. He didn't need to. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Mark, Sophie, and the terrified girlfriend could hear. "My name is Vincenzo Moretti," he stated simply. Mark's face drained of color. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by stark, undisguised terror. Everyone in Chicago knew that name. "And I," Vincenzo continued, his tone conversational but laced with venom, "find your voice offensive. I find your presence offensive. But most of all, I find your disrespect toward this woman unacceptable. Mr. Moretti, I didn't know," Mark stammered, taking a step back, but Vincenzo matched it, closing the distance. "You insulted her weight," Vincenzo observed, his gaze raking over Mark with contempt. A superficial observation from a shallow man. "But tell me, what weight do you carry? How much is your life worth when you owe my associates $50,000 in gambling debts?" Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark's secret was out. Mark's knees buckled slightly. I'm paying it back. I just need time." Vincenzo smiled. It was a terrifying expression. "You just lost your time. You will apologize to her, now, and then you will leave this city. If I see your face again, I won't just collect the debt. I'll collect the collateral." He didn't elaborate, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Mark turned to Sophie, trembling violently. The woman clinging to his arm had already backed away, her eyes wide with fear. "Sophie, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it." Sophie looked at the man who had broken her heart, seeing him now not as a lost love, but as the pathetic coward he truly was. She didn't feel triumph. She felt empty. "Just go, Mark," she said quietly. Mark practically ran for the door, leaving his bewildered date behind. The restaurant remained silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Vincenzo turned back to Sophie. The coldness in his eyes had retreated, replaced by an unreadable depth. He pulled a crisp white handkerchief from his breast pocket and held it out to her. "The mess," he said softly, nodding toward the spilled tray. Sophie took the handkerchief, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tight. "But you didn't have to do that." "He offended my peace," Vincenzo replied, though they both knew it was a lie. "What is your name?" "Sophie." "Sophie Laurent." Vincenzo nodded once. "Clean up your mess, Sophie Laurent. Then bring me a new glass of whiskey. The good stuff." He turned and walked back to his booth, leaving Sophie standing there, the heavy weight of his gaze lingering long after he sat down. She retreated to the kitchen, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had just been defended by the most dangerous man in the city. Why? What did he want? As she poured the Macallan 25, her hands shook. She didn't know if she had just survived a nightmare or stepped into a much darker one. She carried the glass back out, avoiding his eyes as she set it down. "Thank you, Mr. Moretti," she murmured, turning to leave. "Sit," Vincenzo commanded. It wasn't a request. Sophie froze. The manager, watching from afar, offered no help. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, she slowly slid into the booth across from the Mafia boss. Vincenzo took a slow sip of the whiskey, his dark eyes studying her over the rim of the glass. "You carry a lot of pain for someone so young," he observed quietly. "Who taught you to let people walk over you?" "Life," Sophie answered honestly, too exhausted to lie. "Life is a cruel teacher," Vincenzo mused, "but it only teaches you what you allow it to." He leaned forward, the scent of expensive cologne and danger washing over her. "Tell me, Sophie Laurent, what would you do if you weren't afraid?" Before she could process the strange, probing question, the restaurant doors crashed open. 3 men in long coats burst in, and the distinct sound of a shotgun racking echoed through the dining room. "Get down!" Vincenzo roared. Before she could process the strange, probing question, the restaurant doors crashed open. 3 men in long coats burst in, and the distinct sound of a shotgun racking echoed through the dining room. "Get down!" Vincenzo roared. The world exploded into chaos. Screams ripped through the elegant dining room, shattering the veneer of sophisticated calm. The crystal chandeliers swung violently as the first shot shattered a massive mirror near the entrance. Sophie froze, her mind unable to comprehend the sudden violence. She saw the men, their faces obscured by dark ski masks, raising their weapons. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. She felt a massive hand clamp onto her shoulder, yanking her downwards with terrifying force. Vincenzo pulled her under the heavy oak table, just as a spray of bullets tore through the leather upholstery of the booth where they had been sitting seconds before. Wood splintered, and glass rained down around them like deadly confetti. "Stay down! Don't move!" Vincenzo ordered, his voice preternaturally calm amidst the deafening gunfire. He didn't look scared, he looked annoyed. He drew a sleek, black pistol from a shoulder holster hidden beneath his suit jacket. Sophie pressed herself against the cold marble floor, covering her ears, her entire body trembling violently. The smell of cordite and fear filled the air. She could hear the heavy boots of the gunmen crunching on broken glass, moving closer. "Where is he?" one of the men yelled, his voice muffled by the mask. "Find Moretti!" This wasn't a robbery. This was a hit, and she was trapped in the middle of it. Vincenzo moved with lethal grace. He didn't cower. He calculated. He peeked around the edge of the heavy table, assessing the threat. 2 men were advancing down the main aisle. The third was covering the door. "Cover your ears and close your eyes," Vincenzo told Sophie, his tone leaving no room for argument. She obeyed tightly, squeezing her eyes shut. She heard 2 sharp, precise cracks, the sound of Vincenzo's weapon. 2 heavy thuds followed immediately. The screams from the patrons intensified. The third gunman realized his mistake and turned, firing wildly in their direction. Bullets chewed into the floor near Sophie's feet. She couldn't help it. She cried out, curling into a tight ball. Vincenzo cursed in rapid Italian. He grabbed Sophie by the arm, hauling her up. "We move, now!" He didn't lead her toward the front door. He pulled her toward the kitchen, using his own large body as a shield between her and the remaining gunmen. They burst through the swinging doors, startling the kitchen staff who were already huddled in corners. "Back exit!" Vincenzo barked at the terrified head chef. The chef pointed a shaking finger toward a metal door at the rear. Vincenzo dragged Sophie through the chaotic kitchen, the sound of the final gunman giving chase echoing behind them. They burst out into the dark, rain-slicked alleyway behind the restaurant. The cold air hit Sophie like a slap, but she didn't have time to process it. A sleek, armored black SUV was already waiting, its engine purring menacingly. The doors flew open before they even reached it. 2 heavily armed men, Vincenzo's guards, stepped out, weapons drawn. "Boss, you good?" one of them yelled. "Get her in!" Vincenzo commanded, shoving Sophie toward the open door. She scrambled into the spacious, leather-lined interior, gasping for breath. Vincenzo climbed in right behind her, slamming the heavy door shut. "Go! The safe house!" he ordered the driver. The SUV peeled out of the alley, tires screaming against the wet pavement. Inside, the silence was thick and heavy, punctuated only by Sophie's ragged breathing. She huddled in the corner of the back seat, shivering violently, her uniform torn and covered in dust and glass. Vincenzo sat beside her, perfectly composed, reloading his weapon with practiced efficiency. He didn't look at her, his attention focused on the dark streets outside the tinted windows. I want to go home," Sophie managed to whisper, her voice cracking. Vincenzo finally turned to her. His dark eyes were unreadable, but the hard lines of his face had softened, fractionally. "You can't go home, Sophie. The men who attacked me tonight know what you look like. They know you were sitting with me. Until I figure out who sent them and neutralize the threat, your apartment is a death trap." "But I have nothing to do with you. I just poured your drink," she protested, panic rising in her chest. "They wouldn't care about a waitress." "They care about leverage," Vincenzo corrected, his voice flat. "And right now, they think you are mine." "I'm not yours," she snapped, surprising herself with the venom in her tone. Vincenzo didn't react to the outburst. He simply watched her, his gaze intense. "No," he agreed softly. "You are not. But until this is over, you are under my protection, and I do not lose what I protect." The SUV pulled up to massive iron gates set into a high stone wall. The gates swung open silently, revealing a sprawling, fortress-like estate hidden in the affluent suburbs. As they drove up the winding driveway, Sophie realized she had just traded one nightmare for another. She was trapped in the world of the Mafia boss. And worse, as he looked at her with an intensity she couldn't understand, she realized the greatest danger might not be the assassins outside. "Welcome to my home, Sophie," Vincenzo said, the SUV coming to a halt. "Let's get you cleaned up." The SUV pulled up to massive iron gates set into a high stone wall. "Welcome to my home, Sophie," Vincenzo said, the SUV coming to a halt. "Let's get you cleaned up." Vincenzo's estate was a study in cold luxury, high ceilings, dark wood, and minimalist decor that spoke of immense wealth but lacked any warmth. It felt like a museum, not a home. Sophie followed Vincenzo in silence, her body aching, her mind reeling from the violence she had just witnessed. He led her up a sweeping staircase to a massive guest suite. "My housekeeper, Maria, will bring you clothes. The bathroom has everything you need," Vincenzo said, standing in the doorway. He looked at her, his dark eyes sweeping over her disheveled appearance. "You are safe here, Sophie. I give you my word." Before she could respond, he turned and left, closing the heavy door behind him. Sophie collapsed onto the edge of the king-sized bed, burying her face in her hands. The tears she had been fighting finally broke loose. She cried for the fear, the confusion, and the sheer absurdity of her life. Just hours ago, her biggest problem was her cruel ex-fiancé. Now she was a prisoner of circumstance in a Mafia stronghold. Maria, a kind-faced older woman who spoke rapid-fire Italian, mixed with broken English, arrived shortly after with fresh clothes, a simple, elegant silk robe, and a pair of soft pajamas that looked far too expensive for a waitress to wear. After a long, scalding shower that failed to wash away the lingering chill of fear, Sophie dressed in the borrowed clothes. She felt like an imposter. The silk clung to her curves, making her feel exposed. She wandered toward the large window, looking out over the expansive, immaculately manicured grounds illuminated by security lights. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Vincenzo stood there, having changed out of his ruined suit into dark slacks and a black sweater that emphasized the sheer breadth of his shoulders. He held a small medical kit. "You have a cut on your forehead," he stated, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. Sophie reached up, her fingers brushing dried blood near her hairline. She hadn't even noticed. "It's fine. I can—" "Sit," he commanded gently, gesturing to a velvet armchair near the window. Reluctantly, she sat. Vincenzo pulled up a stool, sitting impossibly close. He opened the kit, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft as he prepared a cotton pad with antiseptic. "This might sting," he murmured. As he touched the pad to her skin, she hissed, pulling back slightly. Vincenzo didn't reprimand her. He simply followed her movement, his touch feather-light. For the first time, Sophie truly looked at him. Up close, the dangerous Mafia boss looked exhausted. There were deep lines around his eyes, and a tight tension in his jaw that spoke of a man who carried the world on his shoulders. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You could have just left me. I'm nobody." Vincenzo stopped, the cotton pad hovering inches from her face. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and intense. "You are not nobody, and I don't leave innocent people to pay for my wars," he resumed, cleaning the cut. "Besides, you intrigued me." "Intrigued you?" Sophie scoffed weakly. "Because I let my ex humiliate me." "Because you didn't break," Vincenzo corrected. "You let him speak his poison. But your eyes were angry. You have fire in you, Sophie Laurent. You just let people throw dirt on it." He placed a small bandage over the cut, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second on her cheek. "Why do you believe what he said?" Sophie looked away, the old shame rising. "Because he was right. Look at me. I'm not the kind of woman men fight for. I'm ordinary, and I let him take everything I had. Weight fluctuates. Money can be rebuilt," Vincenzo said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "But loyalty, resilience, the quiet strength to endure, those are rare." He was a fool. He looked at a diamond and complained about the dust. Sophie stared at him, stunned. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this. Not with such raw, unfiltered honesty. It wasn't flattery. It sounded like an empirical observation from a man who studied human nature for a living. "I need to check on my grandfather," she blurted out, suddenly remembering the bakery. "He'll be worried sick, and he relies on my income. I have already sent men to secure the bakery." "From a distance," Vincenzo assured her. "And as for your income, consider yourself employed by me until this is resolved. Your grandfather will lack nothing." He stood up, the moment of intimacy broken. The cold, calculating boss returned. "Tomorrow, I start hunting the men who did this. You will stay here. Do not try to leave. The gates are locked, and the guards have orders to stop you." "Are you keeping me prisoner?" she asked, a spark of defiance returning. Vincenzo paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "I am keeping you alive. Try not to confuse the two." He closed the door, leaving Sophie alone in the quiet luxury. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else now, a strange, unsettling warmth. As she lay in the enormous bed, staring at the ceiling, she realized Vincenzo Moretti wasn't just dangerous. He was a puzzle she was terrifyingly eager to solve. Downstairs, Vincenzo poured himself another drink. He stared at his hand, remembering the softness of her skin. He had enemies closing in, a mole in his organization, and a war brewing. The last thing he needed was a distraction. His phone buzzed. It was his second-in-command, Luca. "Boss, we got a hit on the getaway car. It belongs to the Falcone family." Vincenzo's jaw clenched. The Falcones, old rivals. If they were making a move, the city would burn. He looked up toward the ceiling, toward the room where Sophie slept. He had intended to use her as bait, a necessary pawn to draw out the assassins. That was the plan. But as he felt the phantom heat of her touch, he knew the plan had changed. He would burn the Falcone Empire to ash before he let them touch her. He would burn the Falcone Empire to ash before he let them touch her. 3 days had passed, blurring into a monotonous cycle of luxurious captivity. Sophie paced the confines of her gilded cage, restless and irritated. She had been given everything she could possibly need: books, movies, exquisite meals prepared by a private chef. But she was losing her mind. She wasn't a porcelain doll meant to be kept on a shelf. Vincenzo was a ghost. He left early, returned late, and the only proof he existed was the lingering scent of his cologne in the hallways and the hushed, urgent tones of his men discussing the Falcone situation in the study. By the 4th afternoon, Sophie had had enough. She needed to do something with her hands. She missed the comforting rhythm of her grandfather's bakery, the smell of yeast and vanilla, the satisfaction of creating something tangible. She marched down the grand staircase, bypassing the imposing guards, and headed straight for the massive stainless steel kitchen. The private chef, a severe-looking man named Antoine, frowned as she entered. "Miss Laurent, do you require something? I am preparing the boss's dinner. I need flour, butter, sugar, and yeast," Sophie stated, rolling up the sleeves of her borrowed cashmere sweater. Antoine bristled. "I assure you, my pastries are—" "I'm sure they're excellent, Antoine," Sophie interrupted, her tone firm. "But I need to bake. If I sit in that room for 1 more hour, reading another romance novel, I'm going to scream. Show me where the ingredients are, or I'll tear this pantry apart, looking for them." Antoine, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged in his domain, hesitated. But there was a look in Sophie's eyes, the quiet fire Vincenzo had recognized, that made him reconsider. With a stiff nod, he directed her to the pantry. For the next 3 hours, Sophie lost herself in the familiar alchemy of baking. She didn't make delicate French pastries. She made rustic, hearty Italian bread, focaccia infused with rosemary and garlic, heavy loaves of ciabatta. The physical exertion of kneading the dough was cathartic, pounding her frustrations and fears into the flour. The kitchen, usually sterile and pristine, soon smelled warm, inviting, and distinctly like home. Vincenzo returned just as the sun began to set. He was exhausted, his tie loosened, a dark scowl marring his features. The negotiations with the allied families were falling apart. The Falcones were bolder than he had anticipated. He walked into the foyer, fully expecting the usual cold silence of his estate. Instead, he was hit by a scent that stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't the sophisticated, complex aromas Antoine usually produced. It was simpler, deeper. It smelled like his grandmother's kitchen in Sicily, a memory he hadn't touched in decades. Drawn by the scent, Vincenzo bypassed his study and walked toward the kitchen. He pushed open the swinging door and froze. Sophie stood at the island, her face flushed from the heat of the ovens, a smudge of flour on her nose. She was humming softly, pulling a golden, crusty loaf of bread from the oven. She looked completely out of place in the sterile kitchen, yet entirely perfect. Antoine stood in the corner, looking equal parts horrified and impressed. Vincenzo cleared his throat. Sophie jumped, nearly dropping the heavy baking sheet. She turned, her eyes widening as she saw him. I'm sorry, she stammered, the defiant spark from earlier vanishing. I know I shouldn't be making a mess, but I couldn't just sit there anymore. I needed to do something. Vincenzo slowly walked into the room, his eyes never leaving hers. He ignored Antoine completely. He walked right up to the island, stopping inches from the freshly baked bread. He reached out and tore a piece off the hot crust, ignoring the burn. He brought it to his mouth and closed his eyes as he chewed. The silence stretched. Sophie held her breath, waiting for the reprimand. Vincenzo opened his eyes. My nonna used to make bread like this. Before she died. Before my father moved us to America and turned baking into a business, and then into something else. He looked at Sophie, his gaze intensely focused. It's perfect. Sophie exhaled a shaky breath, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. It's my grandfather's recipe. Well, modified. He taught me that baking isn't just about measurements, it's about feeling the dough. You have a gift, Vincenzo said softly. He gestured to the flour on her face. You have flour on your nose. He didn't hand her a napkin. Instead, he reached out, his large, rough thumb gently wiping the flour away. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through Sophie, her heart hammering against her ribs. Vincenzo lingered, his hand cupping her cheek for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The tension in the room shifted, changing from fear to something hot and undeniable. Vincenzo's eyes darkened, dropping to her lips. Sophie didn't pull away. She found herself leaning slightly into his touch, drawn by the undeniable magnetism of the man. A sharp cough from the doorway shattered the moment. Vincenzo snapped his hand back, turning with lethal speed. Luca stood in the doorway, his face pale. Boss, we have a problem, Luca said, his eyes darting to Sophie and back to Vincenzo. It's your brother. The Falcones grabbed him. Vincenzo's face turned to stone. The warmth in the kitchen evaporated, replaced by an icy, terrifying calm. He didn't say a word to Sophie. He simply marched out of the kitchen, his posture radiating violence. The war hadn't just started. It had just gotten personal. Sophie watched him go, the taste of the warm bread turning to ash in her mouth. She realized with terrifying clarity that she wasn't just intrigued by Vincenzo Moretti. She was falling for him. And she was falling for a man who lived in a world where love was a liability, and death was a daily business. She realized with terrifying clarity that she wasn't just intrigued by Vincenzo Moretti. She was falling for him. And she was falling for a man who lived in a world where love was a liability, and death was a daily business. The estate felt like a tomb the next day. The tension was a living thing, suffocating and heavy. Security had doubled. Men with hard faces and visible weapons patrolled the grounds endlessly. Vincenzo's brother, Matteo, the reckless younger sibling who handled the legitimate front of the family business, was in Falcone hands. Sophie stayed out of the way, acutely aware that she was an outsider in a war zone. But the isolation was gnawing at her. She needed to know what was happening, needed to know if the man who had touched her so gently the night before was going to come back alive. Late that evening, she crept down the stairs, drawn by the low murmur of voices coming from Vincenzo's study. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. "Oh, so, they want the south side ports, Vincenzo." Luca's voice was tense, strained. "If we give them up, we lose 30% of our shipping revenue. We look weak." "I don't care about the ports," Vincenzo's voice rumbled, cold and absolute. "I care about Matteo. He is family. The business can be rebuilt. A brother cannot. But the capos won't accept this," another voice argued. "They'll say you're leading with your heart, not your head. They'll say you're weak. You hand over the ports, and the Falcones won't stop there. They'll demand more. They might kill him anyway. Then I will tear their empire apart, brick by brick," Vincenzo snarled. "I am the boss. My word is absolute. Set up the meeting. I will make the trade." Sophie pressed her hand against her mouth, her heart aching for him. He was a ruthless Mafia boss, yes, but he was also a man willing to sacrifice his empire for his brother. It was a vulnerability she hadn't expected, a crack in his armor that made him devastatingly human. Unable to eavesdrop further, she retreated to the kitchen. She needed to do something. She couldn't fight his enemies, but she could offer the only comfort she knew how to give. She started brewing a strong pot of dark roast coffee and plated the leftover focaccia from the day before. An hour later, the study door opened. The men filed out, their faces grim. Vincenzo remained inside. Taking a deep breath, Sophie pushed open the door, carrying the tray. The study was a dark, imposing room filled with leather-bound books and the scent of expensive cigars. Vincenzo sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his head buried in his hands. He looked utterly defeated. He looked up sharply as she entered, his eyes narrowing. "I thought I told you to stay in your room." "You told me I was safe," Sophie countered quietly, setting the tray on the desk. "You didn't say I had to be a prisoner in my own mind. You look like you need this." Vincenzo stared at the coffee, then at her. The anger drained out of him, leaving only exhaustion. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You shouldn't be here, Sophie. You shouldn't hear these things." "I heard enough to know you're making a difficult choice," she said, pulling up a chair opposite him. "You're trading power for your brother's life. In my world, power is life," Vincenzo muttered, picking up the coffee cup. He took a sip, the bitter liquid seeming to ground him slightly. "If I show weakness, the wolves will circle. The men who swear loyalty to me today will betray me tomorrow if they think I can't protect them. But Matteo, he never wanted this life. He runs the casinos, the restaurants. He stays clean. He's innocent." Sophie thought about the cold, calculating man who had terrified her ex-fiancé, and reconciled it with the man sitting before her now, a man burdened by a crown he couldn't take off. "My grandfather used to say," Sophie started hesitantly, "that true strength isn't about how much you can hold on to. It's about knowing what's worth letting go of. If you let your brother die to keep some shipping ports, what kind of leader does that make you?" What kind of man? Vincenzo's eyes snapped to hers, a flicker of shock crossing his features. In his world, nobody questioned his authority or his morality. They feared him, they obeyed him, but they didn't counsel him, especially not a waitress from a French restaurant. "You are very bold, Sophie Laurent," he murmured. "I'm just honest," she replied, meeting his gaze evenly. "And maybe you don't have to give up everything. Maybe there's a third option." Vincenzo leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, suddenly very interested. "I'm listening." "You said the Falcones want the ports because it makes you look weak. What if you make the trade publicly? You give them the ports, but you make sure everyone knows why. You spin it not as a surrender, but as a demonstration of family loyalty. You show the other families that a Moretti protects his own at all costs. You make loyalty your strength, not your weakness." Vincenzo was silent for a long time, absorbing her words. The tactical brilliance of it was simple, yet profound. It shifted the narrative entirely. It wasn't about losing territory. It was about defining the core values of his syndicate. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming him from a terrifying mob boss into a devastatingly handsome man. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile. "You are a dangerous woman, Sophie," he said softly, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't place. "I'm just a baker," she whispered, blushing. "No." Vincenzo stood up, walking around the desk until he was standing right in front of her. He reached down, taking her hands in his. They were strong, warm, and comforting. "You are far more than that. You see things others don't. You see me." He pulled her gently to her feet. The space between them vanished. Sophie looked up into his dark eyes, reading the vulnerability and the raw desire simmering there. He lowered his head, his lips hovering mere millimeters from hers. "Boss!" The study door burst open. Luca stood there, phone in hand, chest heaving. Vincenzo didn't step back, but his eyes hardened. "What is it, Luca?" Vincenzo growled, irritated by the interruption. "It's Matteo," Luca gasped. "The Falcones. They didn't wait for the meeting. They dumped him outside the gates. Boss, he's in bad shape." "It's Matteo," Luca gasped. "The Falcones. They didn't wait for the meeting. They dumped him outside the gates. Boss, he's in bad shape." Vincenzo was gone before Luca finished his sentence. Sophie followed, running blindly through the grand halls, the sudden shift from quiet intimacy to chaotic terror, leaving her breathless. They reached the front courtyard just as the massive iron gates slammed shut. The rain had started again, slicking the cobblestones. Under the harsh glare of the security floodlights, a body lay crumpled in the dirt. It was Matteo. Vincenzo fell to his knees beside his brother, ignoring the mud soaking his expensive slacks. He pulled Matteo into his arms. The younger man was barely recognizable, his face a swollen, bloody mess, his breathing wet and ragged. "Matteo! Fratellino, stay with me," Vincenzo urged, his voice cracking, a terrifying sound from a man made of stone. "Get the doctor! Now!" He roared at the surrounding guards. Sophie stood frozen on the steps, horror washing over her. She watched Vincenzo, the ruthless boss, cradling his broken brother, his hands shaking as he desperately tried to staunch the bleeding from a deep wound in Matteo's side. This wasn't a movie. This was the brutal, bloody reality of the world she had stumbled into. The estate's private physician arrived moments later, stabilizing Matteo enough to move him to the medical wing hidden deep within the house. For the next 12 hours, the estate held its breath. Sophie didn't return to her room. She stayed in the kitchen, brewing pot after pot of coffee for the exhausted guards, baking anything she could think of, just to keep her hands moving. She felt helpless, a civilian caught in the crossfire of a war she didn't understand. It was near dawn when Vincenzo finally appeared in the kitchen. He looked hollowed out. His shirt was stained with his brother's blood, his eyes bloodshot and dark with a cold, terrifying fury. He didn't speak. He just walked to the sink and began scrubbing his hands, the water turning a faint pink. Sophie silently poured a cup of coffee and pushed a plate of warm croissants toward him. He stared at the food blankly, then slowly picked up the mug. "He will live," Vincenzo said quietly, his voice hoarse. "But he will never walk without a cane again." Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm so sorry, Vincenzo." It was the first time she had used his first name. He didn't react to it. He turned to her, his expression harder than she had ever seen it. The Falcones broke the rules of engagement. They negotiated in bad faith and mutilated my blood. The time for diplomacy is over. "What are you going to do?" she asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "I am going to burn their world to the ground," he stated, stating a fact rather than a threat. He drained the coffee and set the mug down with a sharp clack. "And I am sending you away." Sophie blinked, stunned. "What? Why?" "Because the war begins today," Vincenzo said, stepping closer. "And they know you are here. They know you matter to me. That makes you a target." "I'm not leaving," Sophie said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "I can help. I can—" "You can what?" Vincenzo snapped, his anger finally breaking through his control. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip tight but not painful. "Bake them to death? Offer them advice? This isn't a game, Sophie. Men are going to die. I might die. I will not have your blood on my conscience, too." "You think I'm weak," she argued, tears pricking her eyes, the old insecurities flaring up. "You think I'm just the fat, pathetic waitress Mark said I was. You think I can't handle this?" Vincenzo's face softened slightly, the fury replaced by a profound, desperate ache. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in her hair. "I think you are the strongest person I know," he whispered fiercely. "I think you survived things that would have broken lesser people. But this is my rot, Sophie. I won't let it infect you. I can't protect you when I'm hunting them." He pulled back, framing her face with his large hands, his thumbs wiping away a stray tear. "I am sending you to a safe house in upstate New York. It's secure. My best men will guard you. When this is over, if I am still standing, I will come for you." He didn't give her time to argue. He kissed her, a hard, desperate, bruising kiss that tasted of coffee, fear, and a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. It was a kiss goodbye. He pulled away abruptly, turning his back on her. "Luca will take you in 10 minutes. Pack only what you need." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sophie standing alone, her lips tingling and her heart shattering. She was being sent away for her own good. But as she watched him walk back into the war zone, she realized she didn't want to be safe if it meant being without him. 10 minutes later, as Luca loaded her small bag into the SUV, Sophie looked back at the imposing estate. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a woman who loved a monster, and monsters, she decided, shouldn't fight alone. As the SUV pulled out of the gates, she turned to Luca. "Stop the car." "Miss Laurent, I have orders." "I said stop the car, Luca, or I swear to God, I will jump out while it's moving." She locked eyes with the hardened enforcer. "You know he needs leverage. You know he's walking into a trap, and I know how to give him an advantage." Luca hesitated, the SUV slowing to a halt. "What kind of advantage?" Sophie took a deep breath. She was terrified, but she was done running. "The Falcones think I'm his weakness," Let's show them I'm his weapon. Sophie locked eyes with the hardened enforcer. The Falcones think I'm his weakness. Let's show them I'm his weapon. Luca stared at her, caught between his absolute loyalty to Vincenzo and the undeniable truth in Sophie's words. Vincenzo was walking into a bloodbath, blinded by rage. He needed an edge, and currently, he had none. You're out of your mind, Luca muttered, though he didn't put the car back in gear. If the boss finds out I let you play bait, he'll kill me himself. If he walks into the Falcone stronghold without a plan, they'll kill him, Sophie countered, her voice trembling but resolute. He's going after their leadership, right? The warehouse on the east side. Luca nodded slowly. He's taking 20 men. It's a suicide run. The Falcones will be waiting. Exactly. They expect him to attack head-on. They don't expect a distraction from the rear. Sophie's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of overheard conversations. They know about me. They know I was at the restaurant. If I escape your custody and show up near their territory, they won't be able to resist taking me. They'll want to use me to force Vincenzo's surrender. And then you're dead, Luca said bluntly. Not if you're tracking me. Not if Vincenzo knows where they take me. It splits their forces. It forces them to change their plan. Sophie leaned forward, grabbing Luca's arm. You said it yourself. He's going to die. Let me do this. It took 10 agonizing minutes of arguing, but eventually Luca's desperation won out over his orders. He handed Sophie a small, panic-button tracker, disguised as a simple pendant necklace. If this goes wrong, we both die, Luca warned as he dropped her off 2 blocks from the Falcone-controlled docks. Press the button the moment they grab you. We'll coordinate with the boss's assault. Sophie stepped out into the damp, chilling night air. She pulled the collar of her jacket up, feeling incredibly small and vulnerable. She was a baker, not a spy. But she thought of Vincenzo, of the gentle way he had wiped the flour from her nose, and the fierce protectiveness in his eyes. She started walking. She didn't have to wait long. She purposefully lingered under a flickering street lamp near a known Falcone front, a seedy dive bar. Within 5 minutes, a black sedan pulled up onto the curb, boxing her in. 4 men piled out, grabbing her before she could even scream. She struggled, playing the part of the terrified victim perfectly, but she managed to press the hidden button on her necklace as they shoved her into the back seat. I'm in, she prayed silently. Please hurry. They blindfolded her and drove for what felt like hours, though it was likely only 20 minutes. When they yanked her out, the smell of salt and rotting fish filled her nose. They dragged her into a cavernous, echoing building, a warehouse. When the blindfold was ripped off, Sophie blinked against the harsh overhead lights. She was tied to a chair in the center of an empty concrete floor. Standing before her was an older man with silver hair and a cruel, aristocratic face. Antonio Falcone. Well, Falcone purred, pacing around her. Moretti's little pet. I must admit, I expected someone more glamorous. He went to war over a peasant? Sophie kept her chin up, masking her terror. He went to war because you're a coward who tortures innocent men. Falcone slapped her. The crack echoed loudly, the force snapping her head to the side. She tasted blood. You speak when spoken to, he snarled. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number. Put it on speaker, he ordered one of his men. The phone rang twice before a familiar, low rumble answered. Falcone. Vincenzo. Falcone smiled, a serpent's grin. I hear you're making a mess of my front doors. I suggest you tell your men to stand down. I have something of yours. He held the phone near Sophie's face. Speak. Vincenzo, Sophie cried out, genuine fear lacing her voice now. A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the line. When Vincenzo finally spoke, his voice was no longer a man's. It was the voice of a demon dragged from hell. "If you touch her, Antonio, I won't just kill you, I will erase your name from history." "Big words for a man whose men are currently pinned down," Falcone laughed. "Withdraw your forces. Come here alone, unarmed, and maybe I'll let her go back to baking your bread." "Don't do it, Vincenzo," Sophie yelled. Falcone ended the call, looking pleased with himself. "He'll come. He's weak. He cares too much." Sophie looked up at him, a bloody smile spreading across her face. "You're wrong. He's not weak. And he's not coming alone." Outside the warehouse, the night erupted. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was a coordinated, synchronized breach from the roof and the rear loading docks. The Falcone men, who had rushed to the front to defend against Vincenzo's expected attack, were caught completely off guard by the flanking maneuver. Gunfire tore through the thin metal walls. Falcone's smug expression vanished, replaced by panic. "Kill her!" he screamed at his guards. One of the men raised his gun, pointing it squarely at Sophie's chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the end. The heavy metal doors at the front of the warehouse didn't open. They blew off their hinges entirely. Through the smoke and the falling debris, a figure emerged. He didn't look like a businessman or a reluctant leader. He looked like the devil himself, armed with an assault rifle, moving with terrifying speed and precision. Vincenzo had arrived, and he was not merciful. Before the guard could pull the trigger on Sophie, 2 rounds took him in the chest. He dropped instantly. Chaos erupted within the warehouse as Vincenzo's men flooded in, overwhelming the surprised Falcone guards. Falcone grabbed Sophie, yanking her out of the chair, pressing a pistol to her temple. He used her as a human shield, backing toward a side exit. "Drop it, Moretti, or she dies right now!" Falcone screamed, his composure entirely gone. Vincenzo stopped walking. He stood 10 feet away, his rifle lowered, his eyes locked entirely on Sophie. He didn't look at the gun pressed to her head. He looked at the bruise forming on her cheek, the blood on her lip. The silence in the warehouse was sudden and deafening as the brief firefight ended. Vincenzo's men had secured the room. Only Falcone remained. "Let her go, Antonio," Vincenzo said softly. The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow certainty. "This ends here. I shoot her, then you shoot me. We both lose," Falcone spat, his hand trembling. Sophie looked at Vincenzo. She saw the raw terror in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. She had played the bait, and now she was trapped. But she wasn't helpless. She was a woman who needed dough, who fought through debt, who survived humiliation. She slammed the heel of her heavy boot backward, driving it sharply into Falcone's instep. As Falcone screamed and his grip loosened for a fraction of a second, Sophie threw her weight forward, dropping to the ground. That fraction of a second was all Vincenzo needed. That fraction of a second was all Vincenzo needed. The single deafening crack of Vincenzo's pistol echoed through the cavernous warehouse. Sophie hit the concrete hard, scraping her hands and knees, but the bullet wasn't meant for her. Antonio Falcone collapsed backward, a perfectly placed hole between his eyes. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, dead before he realized what had happened. For a moment, nobody moved. The smell of cordite and copper filled the air. Then, Vincenzo dropped his weapon. The heavy thud of the gun hitting the floor seemed to break the spell. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, falling to his knees beside her. He didn't speak. He grabbed her, pulling her into a crushing embrace. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his large frame shaking violently. It wasn't the shaking of a cold-blooded killer. It was the adrenaline crash of a man who had almost lost his entire world. "You foolish, reckless, beautiful idiot," He breathed, his voice ragged against her skin. "I told you to run. I told you to stay safe." Sophie wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, clinging to him just as tightly. The fear was finally catching up to her, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the dust on his suit. I couldn't let you walk into a trap. I love you." The words slipped out before she could stop them, raw and honest. Vincenzo pulled back slightly, framing her face with hands that were stained with blood and soot. He stared into her eyes, searching for hesitation and finding only truth. "I have burned my soul to keep this empire," he whispered softly, ignoring the dozen armed men looking away to give them privacy. "But I would burn it all again just to keep you." He kissed her, right there in the blood-stained warehouse, amidst the ruins of his enemies. It was a kiss of survival, of desperate relief, and of a promise finally spoken aloud. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered gently through the sheer curtains of the apartment above the bakery. The smell of fresh coffee and rising yeast wafted up from downstairs, a comforting, familiar perfume. Sophie stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her simple white chef's coat. She looked different now. The exhausted, defeated woman who had wiped tables at L'Étoile was gone. She was radiant, her eyes bright, carrying an air of quiet confidence that had nothing to do with her weight or her bank account, and everything to do with knowing her own worth. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, pulling her back against a broad, solid chest. Vincenzo pressed a kiss to the side of her neck, his stubble scratching pleasantly against her skin. "You're going to be late for your own grand reopening," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "I'm the boss. I can't be late," Sophie teased, leaning back into his embrace. Vincenzo smiled, resting his chin on her shoulder, meeting her gaze in the mirror. He too looked different. The heavy burden of absolute power seemed lighter. He still ran the Moretti family. He couldn't simply walk away from that life, but the brutal war with the Falcones had solidified his reign. The streets were quiet, and under his new edicts, the violence was strictly controlled. He had chosen to rule with strategic intelligence rather than pure fear, a shift inspired largely by the woman standing in his arms. "Are you nervous?" he asked, turning her around to face him. "A little," she admitted, "but mostly I'm just ready. My grandfather would have loved this." The newly renovated Laurence Patisserie, financed entirely by Sophie's own hard-won business loan, despite Vincenzo's insistence on paying for it all, was finally opening its doors. "He would be incredibly proud of you," Vincenzo said earnestly, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I am incredibly proud of you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. That wasn't their style. He simply opened it, revealing a stunning, understated diamond ring. Elegant, strong, and flawless. "I don't know how to be a normal man, Sophie," Vincenzo said, his dark eyes vulnerable and sincere. "My world is dark, and it will always have shadows. But you are the light that makes it bearable. Will you marry me?" Sophie looked at the ring, then up at the man who had terrified her, saved her, and finally loved her unconditionally. He hadn't asked her to change. He had never once mentioned her weight, except to threaten the man who weaponized it against her. He had seen the strength she didn't know she possessed, and nurtured it until she could stand on her own. "Only if you promise to keep helping me knead the dough on Sundays," she smiled, tears pricking her eyes. Vincenzo laughed, a deep, joyful sound that still surprised her every time she heard it. He slipped the ring onto her finger. "I am entirely at your service, boss." Later that morning, the bakery was packed. The bell above the door chimed constantly. Sophie moved behind the counter with grace and efficiency, laughing with customers, her heart full. In the corner booth, away from the windows, sat Vincenzo. He wore a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the cozy, flower-dusted environment, but he looked perfectly at peace, sipping an espresso and watching his fiancée command her own small empire. Just then, a man walked into the bakery. He looked familiar, a bit scruffy, clearly down on his luck. He approached the counter, his eyes scanning the display case before landing on Sophie. It was Mark. He looked older, haggard, the arrogance entirely stripped away. He blinked, staring at the confident, glowing woman behind the counter. "Sophie?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Is that you? You look amazing." Sophie paused, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the man who had once broken her, the man whose cruel words had sent her spiraling. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel fear. She felt absolutely nothing. "Hello, Mark," she said evenly. "What can I get for you?" Mark looked around, clearly desperate. I heard you opened this place. I was wondering. I'm in a really bad spot, Soph. I need a job. Just sweeping up anything. Please." From the corner booth, Vincenzo slowly stood up. The relaxed aura vanished instantly, replaced by the lethal predator. He took a step forward, ready to physically throw the man through the plate glass window. But Sophie caught his eye. She shook her head subtly, giving him a small, reassuring smile. She didn't need him to fight this battle. She turned back to Mark, her posture perfectly straight. "I'm sorry, Mark, but I only hire people I can trust. People who respect others. And as you once pointed out, I'm just a fat girl who scrubbed tables. You wouldn't want to work for me." Mark paled, the reality of his past cruelty hitting him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to argue, but the cold, final look in Sophie's eyes silenced him. Defeated, he turned and walked out of the bakery, the bell chiming a cheerful goodbye. Vincenzo walked over to the counter, pride radiating from him. He leaned over, kissing her softly on the cheek. "Remind me never to cross you," Sophie smiled, handing him a warm, fresh piece of focaccia. "Just remember who makes the bread in this family, Moretti." He took the bread, taking a bite, his eyes never leaving hers. "I always do." In the end, Sophie didn't need the Mafia boss to burn the world for her. She had simply needed him to hand her the matches so she could light the fire herself. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, love, and finding strength in unexpected places, please consider liking the video, leaving a comment about your favorite moment, and subscribing to the channel for more original, emotional storytelling. Your support helps bring more stories like Sophie and Vincenzo's to life. Until next time, stay strong and keep reading.